For centuries, Rome felt eternal. Roads stretched farther than any man could walk in a lifetime. Coins passed through millions of hands, all stamped with the same authority. One empire ruled nearly 1/5 of the human population, not by legend, but by routine. Order was normal. Protection was expected. Rome simply worked. And then, quietly, the system began to fail. Not all at once, not loudly. No single enemy delivered the final blow. The empire didn't shatter, it weakened piece by piece. To understand how Rome truly fell, we have to go back to where the cracks first began. In this video, you'll see it unfold through real history, brought to life with AI-driven visuals. The empire at its peak, at its height, Rome was not experienced as an empire. It was experienced as normal life. A farmer in Gaul did not wake each morning thinking about emperors. He thought about weather, soil, and whether the road nearby would bring traders. A merchant in Alexandria did not feel ruled. He felt connected to ports, markets, contracts, and coin. Rome's power worked because it was invisible. Stone roads crossed continents, not as monuments but as habits. A traveler could walk for weeks and never question who maintained the path beneath his feet. Milestones told him how far he was from cities he might never see. Every distance measured. Every route planned. Rome did not conquer only with legions, it conquered with systems. Taxes were predictable. Law was written, copied, enforced. Citizens knew what to expect, and that expectation created trust. Grain ships left Egypt every year like clockwork. They crossed dangerous waters not because sailors were brave, but because Rome paid them to be. The city of Rome itself could not feed its population without these shipments.
Here is your bread.
Hundreds of thousands depended on bread they never saw grown, and it worked for generations. The empire ruled lands so vast that a message sent from one edge might take months to arrive at another. Yet decisions still mattered. Orders were obeyed. Governors feared audits. Commanders feared disgrace more than death. Rome's army was not just large, it was disciplined. Soldiers trained the same way whether stationed in Britain or Syria. They built camps in identical layouts, as if the empire carried its architecture wherever it marched. Even chaos had order. Money tied it all together. Roman coins were trusted not because of gold content alone, but because Rome existed. As long as the empire endured, the coin meant something. A promise backed by legions, laws, and memory. Rome became so dominant that people stopped imagining alternatives. Children were born under Roman rule and died under Roman rule. Entire cultures adapted to it. Languages blended. Local gods stood beside Roman ones. Resistance faded into routine. And this was Rome's greatest strength and its deepest weakness. Because when a system becomes life itself, no one notices the cracks. The empire grew heavier each year. More borders to defend, more officials to pay, more grain to move. More soldiers needed just to hold what already existed. Expansion slowed, but expenses did not. The army stopped bringing back new wealth and started consuming old reserves. Taxes increased quietly. Not enough to spark rebellion, just enough to sting. Local administrators began cutting corners. Bribes became faster than paperwork. Positions were bought, not earned. Still, from the outside, Rome looked eternal. Statues stood tall. Triumphs were celebrated. Coins still bore confident faces. But inside the system, pressure was building. The population was enormous, yet fragile. Cities were crowded beyond anything the ancient world had known. Waste, disease, and hunger lingered just below the surface. Rome depended on everything going right. Weather, trade, labor, peace. There was no margin for disaster, and disaster does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, through missed shipments, through delayed pay, through sickness that lingers too long. At its peak, Rome was unmatched. But it was also stretched thin, holding together millions of lives with routines that could not fail even once. And soon they would. The empire grew too large to manage as one body, so it was divided. 2 emperors, 2 capitals. 2 centers of power pretending to be one. On paper, it looked strategic. In reality, it meant distance, and distance weakens control. The western half, poorer, less stable, depended heavily on taxes and agriculture. The eastern half, wealthier, urban, trade-driven, adapted faster. Rome was no longer balanced. Then came the plagues, not the medieval Black Death, but earlier waves. The Antonine Plague, the plague of Cyprian. They didn't erase Rome overnight. They drained it. Entire legions reduced. Farms left without workers. Tax revenues shrinking quietly. When soldiers die, borders thin. When farmers die, cities starve. When taxpayers die, the empire borrows. And Rome began to borrow from its future. Emperors needed armies loyal to them personally. Civil wars became common. Generals declared themselves ruler. Armies marched not against enemies, but against Rome itself. In 50 years, Rome had more than 20 emperors. Many ruled for months, some for days. Stability vanished at the top. To pay soldiers, the government reduced the silver in coins. Money looked the same but held less value. People noticed. Prices rose, trust fell, savings meant nothing. Inflation spread through markets like a quiet fire. Meanwhile, beyond the borders, pressure was building. Germanic tribes were not yet conquering. They were watching, moving closer, testing defenses. Rome still had walls, still had armies, still had emperors, but the confidence was gone. Farmers fortified their own homes. Cities relied more on local leaders than distant officials. Loyalty shifted from empire to survival. The system that once felt eternal now required constant repair. More taxes, more soldiers, more emergency decisions. And every solution cost more than the last. The empire had not fallen, but it was no longer strong. It was reacting, not leading. And when a superpower begins reacting to crises instead of preventing them, it is already in decline. Rome's enemies did not create its weakness. They waited for it. In 330 AD, Emperor Constantine moved the capital east to Constantinople. The decision made sense. The east was richer, more defensible, closer to trade, but the message was clear. Rome, the city, was no longer the center. The Western Empire began to feel secondary, less funded, less protected, less important. Then came a new pressure, not just tribes, but migration. The Huns pushed westward across Europe, forcing Germanic tribes toward Roman borders. These were not small raiding parties. These were entire peoples, families, wagons, livestock seeking safety. In 376 AD, the Goths asked for permission to enter Roman territory. Rome allowed them in, but Rome failed to feed them. Corruption, greed, and mismanagement turned allies into enemies. Starving refugees became armed rebels. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman army suffered one of its worst defeats. An emperor was killed on the battlefield. For centuries, Rome had been feared. Now it could be beaten. The psychological damage was enormous. The army increasingly relied on barbarian mercenaries. Germanic generals commanded Roman troops. Loyalty shifted from empire to local commanders. Rome was outsourcing its own defense. Then, in 410 AD, something happened that had not occurred in nearly 800 years. The city of Rome was sacked. Alaric and the Visigoths entered the Eternal City. The world froze. Rome, the symbol of order, violated. Temples stripped. Homes looted. Citizens fleeing. It was not total destruction, but it shattered the myth of invincibility. If Rome could be entered, it could be ended. And yet, even then, the empire continued. It staggered forward, but each crisis left it weaker. In 455 AD, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The western provinces were fragmenting. Britain was abandoned. Gaul slipped away, Spain fractured, local rulers emerged. Roman titles meant less. By now, emperors in the West were often young, powerless figures controlled by generals. The real authority no longer sat on the throne. In 476 AD, a Germanic leader named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. There was no massive battle, no fiery apocalypse, just a letter sent to Constantinople. The Western imperial title was dissolved. The empire in the East continued, what we now call the Byzantine Empire. But in the West, Rome was finished, not because of one invasion, not because of one decision, but because over decades its structure had hollowed out. Its economy weakened, its army fragmented, its people stopped expecting protection. By the time the crown was removed, there was nothing left holding it in place. After the fall, when the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was removed in 476 AD, there were no riots in the streets of Rome, no final speech, no great resistance. For most ordinary people, life did not end that day. It had already changed long before. Farmers still worked the land. Merchants still traded, but on smaller scales. Local leaders, not distant emperors, now made decisions. The idea of Rome had lasted longer than its strength, and that idea did not disappear overnight. In many regions, former Roman officials simply continued governing, only now under new rulers. Germanic kings adopted Roman laws. They kept Roman tax systems. They even dressed like Roman elites. Because Rome, even in collapse, still defined legitimacy, but something fundamental was gone. The roads were no longer repaired regularly. Long-distance trade declined sharply. Urban populations shrank. Cities that once held hundreds of thousands fell to a fraction of their former size. Without the empire's centralized structure, complex systems broke down. Aqueducts crumbled, bathhouses closed, libraries were neglected. Knowledge did not vanish, but access to it narrowed. Security became local, power became personal. Instead of a vast empire stretching across continents, Europe fragmented into smaller kingdoms. And for centuries, no single power would unite it again in the same way. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, continued for nearly another 1,000 years. But the Western world had shifted. What replaced Rome was not immediate chaos. It was transition. A slow transformation from empire to medieval order, from centralized authority to feudal bonds, from imperial citizenship to local loyalty. Rome did not fall in one dramatic moment. It eroded. Over generations, through plague, through economic strain, through political instability, through migration and war, its enemies did not invent its weakness. They stepped into it. In the end, Rome's greatest strength, its vastness, its complexity, its reliance on interconnected systems became its vulnerability. When those systems faltered, there was no simple way to repair them. And so the empire that once ruled nearly 1/5 of humanity did not explode. It faded. Not with flames lighting the sky, but with structures quietly failing. And the world that followed would spend centuries living in the shadow of what Rome had been.